welcome everybody. So today we are talking to these two talented young women, and our theme is a relook, a revisiting of the Ramayana and the characters of the Ramayana, specifically the women characters. And we will start with Samhita, and we will start with her most recent book, just out in March, I think this year, 2013. This book has kind of reinvented Ramayana. It is told from the viewpoint of a journalist who's searching for the missing Sita. And what does she find? What happens? I'll let Samhita take over from here and give you the dope on it.
Anjali, you've done a great job of describing what the book is all about, so I don't think I need to add anything to that. Basically, there's a journalist who is searching for what actually happened to Sita, sort of reimagined Ramayana happening today. And I'm just going to read a little bit from where the journalist gets put into jail for asking the wrong sorts of questions, and she meets certain people in jail, and I'm just going to read from there. So she meets someone there who asks her, "What are you here for?" And I'm going to start reading from this point. For asking the wrong questions. What was the question you asked? What happened to Sita? I stated not as a question, but a fact. Oh, her voice hardens. It's about Sita. It's always about Sita. I'm puzzled. What do you mean? I'm a Lankan, she says, bitter. I'm here too because of Sita. She is silent after that. Moments pass and then I hear a door rattle. I turn towards the door as footsteps pound the dirt floor, but it is not my cell that is being opened, it is hers. I hear low murmur voices. I hear her shriek and yell, scratch and claw, and then there is silence. The door slams. Hello, are you there? I whisper again. Silence. I fall asleep, awaken, and fall asleep again. Sometime later, I hear the door rattle, hear the dull scuffle of a body being dragged. Minutes later, I hear her cry. Are you okay? I whisper, and immediately I realize the odd choice of words. Where did they take you? What did they do? They took me for interrogation. She lays a particular ironic emphasis on the last word. Why? Because I'm a terrorist. Did they hurt you? Of course, she sneers through her tears. But I live, I will. Silence again. What is Lanka like? I ask her, when the silence gets too much to bear. She tells me that there are streets in Lanka, streets upon streets, filled with Ravana's old harem. Vibhishana turned all of them out of the palace years ago. There wasn't enough money to keep them. He housed only the legitimate queens, Mandodari and a few others. But the rest of them, who had once lived cushy, pleasure-filled lives, have nothing now. Lanka has the best and most beautiful whores now, remnants of Ravana's famed harem. Many of your European politicians and soldiers come for a few days for the whores. It's not the boring part that troubles me so much, to be honest, she adds after a pause. If that's the way you've got to make a living, you've got to do it. It's the fact that the men you sleep with are the ones who kill your husband, your brothers, your father, your sons. I tried to imagine Lanka, a city full of whores, full of bomb streets and soldiers. So different from Ayodhya. Just as my eyelids start to droop, she speaks again. My mother was raped when you won. I was a child then, 8 years ago. She pauses and I do a quick calculation and realize that she must be barely 18. Too young to be in prison. I went with her after the last battle, after Ravana was killed, to find my father's body. There was terror in her eyes. I saw them as she gazed at the hordes of Vana soldiers amassed on the battlefield. She knew what was going to happen. She clutched me tight as we searched through the piles of dead, looking for my father's corpse. She told me, everything is going to change. I couldn't understand. But it was horrible. The smell of decay, the stench of blood. The ground was slippery with blood. There was blood drying on my hands, on my clothes. We came home and later that night we heard the drunken songs of Ram's soldiers as they celebrated our grief. There was fire too, spreading through our quarter, and my mother bundled us, me and my sister, into a tiny cupboard. It was suffocating. They came then, minutes later, a bunch of them. I couldn't see anything, but I heard everything. The crude jokes, the pillaging, the curses. My mother's voice pleading with them not to just to take everything and go, but they didn't. I heard it all. She pauses for a moment. It didn't take too long, perhaps just 15 minutes. They left the house and my mother brought us out of the cupboard. She held us, but I could see in those 15 minutes she had changed. She had become a different person. There was a dullness to her, I don't know how to describe it. When I asked her years later, she told me that I couldn't understand, that I never would understand. But I think it was that which led me here. How unfair it was. For the sake of one woman's virtue, for the sake of one wife, so many women were raped, so many were widowed, so many children orphaned. Who do you blame?
So she's also given voice to some of the female characters in the Ramayana that we read about them and then we go on to the main events of the epic. So I will hand you over to Meena Kandasamy, our feminist poet.
Thank you, Anjali. There are basically Miss Militancy was this reworking of Tamil and Hindu myths and putting them either in a contemporary context or putting it from another person's perspective. So there will be 3 poems from the Ramayana that I'm reading. 2 are on Sita. The last one is on Shurpanaka, and without further explanation. Princess in exile. Scorned, she sought refuge in spirituality and was carried away by a new age guru with saffron clothes and caramel words. Years later, her husband won her back, but by then she was adept at walkouts. She had perfected the vanishing act.
Should we come back?
Yeah, it's fine. It's just that the gods are angry. A random access man. His voice balloons always came out empty as hiccups. He was not a husband who shared his secrets. He was not a husband who shared his spoonful either. On cold nights, he played Gandhi to her waiting wife's body. Denial aroused desire and lust rolled on her breast. Lust rode her hips. Sure that he would never come, she sent her digged husband on a wild goose chase. Get me the testicle of a golden deer, she said, get me its musk so that we can rouse your manhood. She picked herself a random man for that first night of fervor. This one was all hands and all heads, and he spoke only in whispers. He taught her tongue. First he named the word for her womb, but the word for her waters, and she devoured every word. And within her another woman arose, hot and forever hungry. By the time she left the stranger's lap, she had learnt all about love, first to last, Mamacita. And the last poem, we'll do the last one, which is the Shurpanaka one. Traitress. Widowed, forsaken, and ordered to exist in erasures, with nothing on offer but love and a woman's body. She flew north for foreign fare, met 2 men, Aman ex-man. She chose cunt over country, an awesome threesome, learnt all about another culture by sleeping with it. Brothers in bed, they made her wear leather, wheeled whips, teased her, pleased her for what seemed like forever. She sought a license, a contract, fixed hours of fuck. The married man, the taller one, smelled something fishy. Bigamy and a phobia of beginning wives made him plot. He crafted it with gags, cuffs, chains, knives, harnesses, flattened, her protrusions torn away, ears, nose, breasts. Taken to task, they told the world she was sharp-clawed, long-nosed, big Buddha-eared, pot-bellied, cross-eyed, with a potato peeler voice and a neck that grew at night. Thank you.
Thanks, Leena. So these are radically new voices from old characters, and I would like to ask a question put a question to both of you. Meena, maybe you could go first. How easy or difficult is it for you to give a voice to these characters? How do you put yourself in their shoes? How do you make them come alive on your pages?
I think with Sita, for instance, I have to also give a little bit of preface. The fact is that my father was an RSS pracharak till he was 31 before he met my mother, married her. and he was arrested during the emergency. So, and most of my childhood was in this very Hindu, what I call very fascist environment. So, the Ramayana was something that was compulsory reading and something you took very seriously. And Sita is this ideal wife, and you have these pictures of Ram, Sita, and all that. And then the fact is that it's one thing to accept the story as it is, but also to look at Sita. Well, Sita, isn't she this woman who goes and talks to a stranger when somebody tells her not to talk to strangers? That's not at all a good Indian girl thing. And then isn't she this woman who crosses this line and there's clearly a line drawn and said don't step across this line? That's also clearly another not good Indian girl, good Hindu girl thing. And so you realize that it's which way do you look at the story? You can look at her as this subservient wife, or you can look at her as a woman who is really crossing the threshold, crossing these boundaries, talking up to strangers, and also at the same time telling this guy, go and get me something that I want, that I totally desire. So I think for me, these characters are some, once you get, I think I read a lot of Joseph Campbell, and I think we both will also go back to it in terms of why using myth for storytelling or poetry is important, but at the same time, you want these very different versions. The versions already exist in the story, but you really want to liberate them and put them in a much more empowering or much more actual context where you could identify with them. Or for instance with Shurpanaka, she's like this beautiful person. She has a huge history in Sri Lanka itself, and then in Lanka itself, and then why is she shown as this, demoness, and what's the purpose of, casting this woman as a demon? Or the fact that how was she disgraced, like you take away a woman's beauty, and how central is this idea of beauty? It's almost like, Sita is beautiful, she's good and demure, but the other woman is the woman who's just like Sita, but slightly more vehement in expressing her desire, and then she becomes condemned to be, looked upon as a very, ugly person, or this a very savage person. And what do you do with women's desire? Because I think it's a question that troubles society a lot. Women's sexuality is something that's seen as a destabilizing factor in society. So it's quite it's very interesting to look at them, and also you understand it's very easily, at least within the idea of myth, it's like women are troublemakers. It's Sita's desire for the deer that caused the problem. It's Shurpanaka's desire for the men that caused this problem. So the fact is that how many times it's and this is something that again and again, it's not just that it stops with the Ramayana, it comes into your everyday, it comes into your bedroom, it comes into how you respond to sex. So the fact is that it's constant denial. You've been forced to deny what you feel, you've been forced to deny your desire. So, and I think it's permeated the system. So at some point of time, and it's also, it gives a very easy way out. It's one thing for me to actually go and say, yeah, Meena Kandasamy likes sex, but it's also another thing to use these voices and say, there are people from, history or stories through whom you can speak and get away with it. Because at some points it becomes too difficult to, put it all as you who want it, because then you're like this one insane person. But it's much more easier to take a story which is already there and, use it or subvert it to your own aims.
Right. It's like there are all these worlds and women living in your head, and you just have to bring them out because you've been thinking about them. Yeah. And Samita, the same question to you. Yeah. So, all these voices and the voices for women that you've got in your story, how do you even say that this is what she must be thinking? How do you put yourself in their shoes?
Thank you for that question, and with that I will move a little bit to show you some of the kind of ways we've tried to think about Sita and other women's perspectives on in this other book, Sita's Ramayana. Before I show you this, I have to also mention that the primary storyteller of Sita's Ramayana is not me, it's the artist Moina Chitrakar. And so for me it was not just about looking at Sita, but it was trying to look at Sita and other characters from the Ramayana through Moina's eyes, and try to create a text that reflected what I thought the images were trying to say or trying to communicate. And the purpose of the text here is just to footnote or give a context for the images we see. And it's fascinating for me to for me to have worked on Sita's Ramayana, because it stems out of this Patua tradition, and Moina was the artist and she illustrated it, and then the images came to me and I had to create a text around these images. But it's so evocative. This was the first image that I saw, and it immediately tells you what Moina's perspective on the Ramayana is. It's a tragic story. It's Sita crying in the forest. It's not necessarily the victory of good over evil. It's the misfortune that happens to this woman and her need to communicate and tell the story to somebody else, not to remain silent or submissive. But here you can see also the plants, the only audience she can find, the forest itself, have a perspective here. I mean, they have eyes and they're crying as well, they're weeping at her story, if you can see the image. So that's, I think that was important. That kind of gives, in telling this kind of story, it gives Sita more agency than we have traditionally perceived her having. I just also want to throw this image in here about Surpanakha and that Lakshman incident, which Meena also, her poem was about. And also the idea, how do we put in Sita's voice what actually the encounter between Surpanakha and Lakshman, and how do we voice the act of violence that's happening to her? What is Sita's take on this violence that happens to Surpanakha? That's something we never hear about. So that was quite interesting to also work within, because there's, in the images also you can see this sort of, there's violence there. They have brought their weapons to the forest, violence calls to violence. If you've brought weapons to the forest, violence will pursue you and you will be sort of forced to create an act of violence. We tried to bring that out as well. And also bring out the fact that it was this act of violence that led to Sita's abduction. It's one thing leads to another as well. Just to give you a sense of the kind of images we used, I mean, Moana's artwork in this book. I also really like this image because you see Sita in her, this is the moment where Lakshman is drawing the Lakshman Rekha, and Moana's drawn her as sort of being in a jail. You have these bars very dramatically across her face. She'd drawn a number of images, so we felt like we had to use those number of images as well, because it emphasized over and over again that this was sort of Sita, the Lakshman Rekha in a sense was also sort of an imprisonment. And when Ravana comes, when he brings music, he comes in the guise of a wandering minstrel. This is a moment of breaking free also from that kind of prison. Unfortunately, it's a moment that doesn't hold that promise. One of the other things that was also really interesting to bring in this women's perspective, because we were really focused on it being Sita's point of view, Sita's perspective on the Ramayana. But the fact is that some of the most crucial events, Sita's absent. She doesn't actually see these events. She doesn't see Ram searching for her, getting this army together, building this bridge and coming. And she doesn't see any of the war. But she's Vibhishana's daughter. She has the ability of far sight. She also has the ability to dream of what's going to happen in the future. And she knows that Lanka is going to fall. She knows that this is doomed and this is the wrong thing to do, but she chooses to stay in Lanka even when her father crosses over to be with Ram, because this is her place, this is her people, and she's made friends with Sita. And how will Sita know what's going on without her to be able, through her dreams, through her far-sight darshan kind of ability, tell her what's going on? So we narrate, like Sanjaya narrates to the Dhrashtra, we use Srijata as a device to narrate what's happening on the battlefield. And this created some sort of an interesting tension for us, because obviously Sita's on Ram's side, wants Ram to win, but Srijata is also watching the destruction of her own people in this. So that was a way also to nuance that kind of perspective. Anyway, I think I've talked enough.
What is really interesting here is that we hear of all these silent women so far in the Ramayana. Trijata. I didn't know there was a character called Trijata in the Ramayana till I read Sita's Ramayana. Surpanakha, whom we all know as a demoness, wild, wicked woman who tried to tempt Lakshman. But of course, she's living, thinking person. So what does she feel about it all? So why don't you guys tell us something more about these characters that about Trijata, even Tara is a character in your Ramayana, and Tara also has a point of view. And Tara is again somebody we don't know anything about. So could you, just elaborate on that more?
So when I look at the Ramayana, I look at it as a very constructed text. It's a work of literature. It's got beautiful, just the symmetry of it, the way things are foreshadowed, the way situations are created is just amazing. And I think one of the reasons Tara exists in this work is sort of, in some ways, for us to realize what could have happened to Sita. Like this is here again you have Vali and Sugriv quarreling over a kingdom. This sort of is a weird parallel to the situation with Ram and Bharat. What happens to the woman trapped in this situation? And Tara really is about that. Yeah.
She's being batted about between Vali and Sugriv, and all we know is that she was this person's wife, then taken over by this guy, and we don't really see her point of view at all in the whole story. Yeah.
But she has this wonderful incident in the Valmiki Ramayana, and so many people tend to gloss over this, where Tara actually stands up to Ram and says, "Is this the right thing to do? You have made me a widow and a wife in the course of, from a wife to a widow in one day, and it's, what is this? Am I supposed to weep, or am I supposed to rejoice because I've been widowed and here I am to be married again?" Whoa. Yeah.
And this theme of violence is also running through the whole narrative. And what I feel is that both of you, especially you, this may be an epic that's thousands of years old, but the issues are so current, so modern. We're dealing with these issues even today.
Going back to the earlier question as well on why the Ramayana, or the idea of the Ramayana as literature, and why not just movie. I think for me, when I planned Miss Militancy, I knew that it's not going to be my first collection where you just collect poems that you've written for the last 5 years and you say it's a collection and you put it into the world. I was a very serious point at that point. I had this project of retelling all these Hindu and especially a lot of Tamil mythology, Kannagi or Andal and their stories in a different manner. But I also think that what made me very keen about the project is much more than, let's say, the poetic sensibility, is the fact that these epics have been twisted for extreme religious purposes, and not only religious but also extreme patriarchal ends. So you have the idea of Sita which is being foisted just so that you're telling girls to do this, or the story of Shurpanakha. Look at what happens to bad women. Look at what happens to women who desire. You're having your ears or your nose or your breast off. So in that sense, the way in which, or the story of what happens to Draupadi, or any of the especially within the Ramayana, all these stories are they are used for a very certain didactic purpose. And so what you want to do at that point is to tell them, please, can you just listen to it again? Let's go over the story and we can take another moral out of it. And this is going to be a more empowering version. This is going to be a more feminist version. This is a version I want to own up to. And there is no, if there is a story, there can be no single message. It's up to the person to take away what they want to take away. And in some ways, you really want to take away a much more powerful component out of it instead of, the traditional Sang Parivar version of the Ramayana. So you just have to inhabit that space and make it your own.
Can I just add something to that? I mean, also, what we've, in the last couple of years, I mean, we've had this whole controversy about Ramanujam's essay in DU and the fact that there are many versions of the Ramayana, but we've lost so many versions. I was brought up in a generation which was all about the Ramayana you watch on television. I did not know that these other versions existed, and they could give me a way to navigate my own discomfort, my own concerns about the Ramayana as a story. And that's one of the reasons that we wanted to work on Sita's Ramayana, because there are these alternative versions, these oral traditions, these other subversive forms of critiquing, expressing discomfort with the story that have somehow exited our mainstream in the last so many generations, and I think we need to bring that back into the conversation.
No, this is my last note, and I will not voice this on you. The fact is that I'm coming from Periyar, from Tamil Nadu, which has this huge Periyar tradition, and you have this M.R. Adaski Mayana, for instance, which is this alternative, the debunking of the Ramayana. You have Ambedkar's book, which was banned in India at the time, Riddles in Hinduism, in which he questions. And I think the political project is not a literary project. The political project is just a project of iconoclasm. You just want to break these stories. But I think the literature person is a far more wicked person, in that you actually can be extremely, you go into the story, you change the story, you subvert it, so that for them, once, you read it, your Sita is no longer your Sita, she's also the Sita that I write about. She's also this feisty woman. So, and that, your iconoclasm doesn't do that, because that is somebody just destroying something, but you're not destroying something, you're giving an alternate version, and that's the fact, isn't it? Once you see something, you cannot unsee it. So once you see this, feisty Sita, once you see this very desirable Shurpanakha, then you cannot unsee it, you cannot say that ceases to exist. And I think that's much more literary way of approaching, instead of just the political way in which you say, oh, all these myths are bad just for call and something. Instead, you'd rather engage with them and tell them in new ways. I think.
Sorry, just to add to this. It's just going on and on and on. And also, I realize it's probably lunchtime, so if anyone wants to exit and head for lunch, please do, but we're going to continue. We're going to continue. In Periyar's version you brought up, it sort of again sort of inverts this whole conqueror narrative, and it's very political. But also in Karnataka we have Kuvempu, who took this very disturbing episode of what happens to Shambhuka in the Ramayana, the Shudra who sort of executed by Ram for penance, for trying to be like an ascetic, for trying to be like a rishi. So Shambhuka, so Kuvempu was a Dalit, had so many issues with that, even though he was a Ram Bhakt. So he retold the story where finally, Shambhuka ascends to heaven, and it's he creates this Brahmin character, sort of saying to Shambhuka, you can't do this, you can't be an ascetic, you should be killed. And that Brahmin character eventually becomes this Bhakt of Shambhuka who rises to heaven. So that's an inversion of the story. That's a way of retelling the story in problematic areas. And the fact is, Kuvempu was what, 19, I'm not exactly sure of the dates, but maybe in the last century, but many decades before us. And he is part of a generation, of a continuation of a tradition that keeps retelling the Ramayana, and even subverting it, changing the endings, playing around that's happened continuously through history.
In fact, there's some folk tale that ends with the thing that do not marry your daughters to the men of Ayodhya. There's a folk tale of almost like a moral when men from Ayodhya are bad. They cause pain and suffering and violence. One last thing about the Patwa artists also, because I think the women, when they go around telling the stories, performing them, they also have this alternate vision of history. When they narrate the story, it's not always the Ramayana that we know. They have their own versions. They have voices for characters which we've never heard about. They perform them, and they educate people about what might have been, could have been, the silent histories of epics that we know nothing about.